Hello everyone, thank you for coming to Responsible for Equality and Liberty's Human Rights Day event at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. My name is Shireen Kdosi, and I'll be speaking to you today about othering and human rights within the context of healthcare. First of all, a very warm thank you to Jeffrey M. for organizing us all today and bringing us together. So thank you, Jeffrey, for your efforts and for everyone for making time for being with us today. My own unique personal background is within the question of othering in radical Islam. That was what brought me to the question of othering within the context of our human collective. So it was a very specific seed question that I had after 9/11 that brought me to a much bigger question of radical ideologies across the spectrum. I spent, 10 years alone within specifically the counter-extremism sector, looking at every ideology from ISIS to neo-Nazis to Antifa to school shootings to, of course, radical Islam. And I worked with other organizations to spread that message across the United States and to understand why, what is driving ideologies and what is driving extremism within these ideologies. And it's always been a question of belonging, right? So after 2020, I left the nonprofit sector and I dove deeper into the rabbit hole of the question of human belonging. And I published a book called The Song of the Human Heart, Dawn of the Dark Feminine in Islam, which looks at that seed question within Islam, right? What is it that brings us to other someone else? And what does that mean to other someone else? It means to take an individual or a group of people and to push them beyond the pale, to push them outside of a group belonging, right? And that is, it seems as a very complicated thing. It's, when we look at extremism, when we look at ideologies across the board, and we see these very gargantuan movements or these very complex philosophies, we get overwhelmed. We tend to get overwhelmed. We tend to get inundated with the minutia of, okay, well, what was the history? What was the pattern that led to this behavior, essentially? But really, I found in my studies and in my time speaking with extremists that the question is really much simpler. The question of othering is pushing an individual beyond the pale, and pushing them so beyond the pale that not only do you not see them as human anymore, but you see them as open game, or it's open season on them, right? So it becomes not only that you other another group of people, but that you now see them as available targets for whatever aggression you might have, whatever frustration you might have in your own personal life or in your collective. That other thing, that other person, that other idea becomes a target, and it becomes open season on the target. And I think we can all see that happening right now in the world collectively, in how we talk about other people, in the kind of conflicts that are happening worldwide. What I want to focus on really is the language and the rhetoric around how we speak and how that drives this othering. What is othering? Othering is when you take a group of people, an individual, an idea, a set of any kind, and you push them beyond the pale, you push them beyond the perimeter of society. These are very ancient human patterns. We've seen them since time immemorial between, one clan and another clan. We've seen them between one tribe and another tribe. We've seen them between one god and another god. And so what happens is not just that they're other, that they're separated or segregated from society, but in doing that, they become open season, right? They become open game for the collective frustrations, the trauma. There's always an outlet where, unless we work with that trauma and that frustration and that grief, if we do not do that, it becomes weaponized, and the aim becomes the other. And so what I do in my work now, in my books, in my speaking, in my writing on Substack, I look to see, can we look between things? Can we look between where a group is here and where the other is over there? And can we look at that space between to understand what is going on, and can we use that, right? Can we use that to generate another way of seeing ourselves and others, for lack of a better term, to create a new relational reality where we aren't so separated, and perhaps we can come together in a more cooperative way. So when I first saw this idea of othering within the context of human health or within the context of healthcare, it always came around as an idea of some disease that needed to be solved or cured or vanquished. And so I saw this a lot when I was speaking about radical Islam. I saw a lot of that rhetoric from really well-meaning people, where they would say, oh, this is a disease of this, a disease of that. It would be something like the disease of radical Islam, or the disease of white supremacy, or the disease of, you name it. And I think we can all recognize that rhetoric. We've all heard it. And it seems really well-meaning, because who doesn't want to eradicate a disease? But the problem is that, culturally, what we do is when we look at these issues, real human issues that are arising in our culture, and we just label it as a disease, we've already othered it. We've already seen it as something that needs to be eradicated, right? And it's not just that it needs to be eradicated. The language around that is really specific. It's almost like it needs to be sanitized. And as I read about in my books, that is a much more sinister approach than I could even begin to unwrap in a very brief conversation here. When we look at something that needs to be sanitized, we are looking to cleanse it. We're seeing that play out in global wars right now, where there's ethnic cleansing. There is religious attempts to religiously cleanse a population of their beliefs through advocacy. There are attempts to sanitize a population, to remove people who don't look like us, or who don't look like the collective, or what is seen as the collective, or who don't live their lives a certain way. And that sense of sanitization is so sinister under the guise of, perhaps a value, but is sinister in the sense that not only does it otherize the target, the thing that is being aimed, the people that are being aimed at, it also divorces us from ourselves, right? Because we create this idea or this identity that we have to live in this pristine sort of environment, this pristine population, this pristine community. We're seeing that right now I've seen that within the extremism on the national front, where there was an article I wrote on Substack, and my Substack is called Into the Rabbit Hole. There was an article I wrote about nationalism and naturalism, and what we're seeing right now within the US, for example, with immigration, this idea that we have to cleanse the population of people who are brown or foreign. This is not an event, right? This is not an idea that is new to us. This is an idea that is, at least 200-300 years old. It started before World War II, and it continues to this day. And the idea is that we have to cleanse our land of people who are seen as an invasive species, so to speak, which is exactly the rhetoric of disease, right? Or that we see the same kind of rhetoric within the context of healthcare. And the reason that kind of rhetoric is unfortunately effective is because who doesn't want to eradicate a disease? If you've ever had a serious illness, obviously we all want to be healthy, but when you take what is well-meaning within the context of healthcare and you apply it to people, it becomes a weapon, right? It becomes something that is used then to inflict tremendous amounts of pain and suffering onto a population using very, very simplistic language. And so what we look at, we see behavior or identity as a disease. That language becomes a trap. And what do you instinctively want to do with a disease is you want to wipe it out. You want to eradicate it. You want to cleanse it. And the irony within all that is that as much as we say we want to eradicate a disease, or we label things a disease, when I worked in counter-extremism, what I noticed was that there would be this hyperfixation on the so-called disease. There would be a hyperfixation on what was wrong. So rather than try to understand where people were coming from, and where people are coming from, it's really not that complicated. It's a question of human belonging. People are, when they're otherized, when they're pushed beyond the pale, when they're pushed outside of a perimeter, it may seem like one or two people at a time, but over time, what is on the outside is actually far exceeding in numbers and capacity what is on the inside. And what I saw is that, when you're trying to understand extremist behavior, extremist ideologies, what people would do, really well-meaning people, from counter-extremism officials to elected officials to influencers to even journalists and reporters, is that they would stare at that quote unquote disease. They would stare at that problem, or they would stare at the behavior that is driven by a certain ideology. And rather than looking at it a different way. So when you're trying to understand what is going on, if you take a look, for example, at, I don't know, let's say a gaping wound on your arm, the way that we are, if we're going to go with that analogy, the way that we treat otherness now in the context of things that are undesired or unwanted, an ideology or a behavior pattern, the way that we treat it now is that we look at it like a disease and we just say, okay, chop off the whole arm or kill the whole person because it's diseased. Or we stare at that problem. We just stare at it with hyperfixation, which is another form of amplifying the problem, because we're not looking to understand it, right? We're looking to monetize it for content. We're looking to perhaps exploit it for our own agenda, but we rarely look at it with wonder and curiosity. And that's what I mean by when I say aim better. It's not aim as in a weapon, it's aim as in your eyesight, your focus, your vision. Not aiming at others as targets, but aiming our focus on the thing at hand, the situation, the problem, the dilemma, the wound, so to speak, with curiosity. And therein lies a really important distinction, because when we keep looking at something and we keep looking at our environment or ideologies or our patterns, significant cultural events or news events, and we look at it like it is something to be squashed, then that becomes the only language we know, which is another form of another behavior pattern that is not that different from a disease itself, right? A disease looks to overtake, it looks to overpower, it looks to conquer. And when we, despite having the best interests, take that same approach towards a problem, we become another kind of disease. And so you've got a clash of not civilizations, but you've got a clash of disease and disease. But if we change our perspective and we look at a situation with wonder, and we look at it as a wound that needs to be understood, it becomes a deepening. We can deepen our own lens, and we can look at then not just the problem, so not just the wound, but the environment that the wound is in. And that's really important, to look at the environment that a challenge is embedded in. And what essentially in my studies and in my time within this sector, I've spent the last, since 2020, I've spent the last 5 years now outside as my own kind of othering, that I self-imposed othering. I kind of left the nonprofit sector, I left the counter-extremism sector, and I othered myself so I could be more on the periphery and looking more objectively at what's going on. What I find is that the reason we have this pattern of othering, the reason that we have this wound essentially, is because of the environment, right? The environment that the wound is in. And you can insert any issue, any problem in place of the word wound, and you have the same sort of analogy, and it works, right? Whether it's a genocide, or whether it's immigration, or whether it's, extremist groups from any background, whether it's even the conflict between men and women right now, which seems to be really on the rise. It is an issue of the environment. And what I mean by that is something very unique. I don't just mean that we are in different landscapes, so to speak. I propose in my books and in my writings that we are not just in different landscapes, right? The wound is not just in a territory that is perhaps hostile and creating that wound. The issue is that the wound is trapped in a timescape, so not landscape, but timescape. So let's take a closer look at that. When we look at MAGA, right, Make America Great Again, it is a wound that is trapped within a very fixed, semi-inherited identity from, let's say, the 1950s, right? This era that was supposedly great for some people. And it is a desire to get back to that. So it is a wound, right? If you look at the national situation that we're dealing with on every front in which MAGA affects policies and behaviors and others, for lack of a better term, it is an issue of believing that our being belongs in a different time, right? And when we look at, for example, the issue with the genocide, with Israel and Gaza and the Palestinians, we're looking at, again, another kind of a wound. Of course, there is a backstory. Of course, it's much more complicated, but my goal is not to make it more complicated. My goal is to make it simpler for everyone. And when we look at the rhetoric behind that, where does this othering come from? How does this group of people just so simply otherize their neighbors or people who are not like them? And it comes from this fixed point in time where Jews believed that they were existing at a certain place in time, and that the beliefs that were crafted around that certain place and time in history, where it was, supposedly God gave them the land, let's just put it really simply, they believe that moment is fixed in time. And when you fix something in time, whether it's MAGA or Israel, or even let's look at Islam, Islam is also the problem with Islamic extremism, the problem with Islam where it fails its potential. And there are so many cases of that. Of course, Hamas being one of them, but that is just one example. Islam is a much more diverse sort of population group, so the problems are a little bit more diverse. But again, the wounds that surface from that territory, from that belief system, are also fixed in a rupture in time, right? The rupture is not so much environmental or a landscape, but it is a rupture in time. And that is because there are so many different waves of philosophies and ideologies that are stuck in a different time that fractures collective reality. And again, my book, The Song of the Human Heart, Dawn of the Dark Feminine Islam, really hones into this concept of time. So again, 3 really topical examples: MAGA, Israel, radical Islam. These are ruptures in time, and they're fixing themselves in a fixed point of time. So while life is very organic, while human curiosity and wonder is very organic, and it's constantly moving in ebb and flow, the ideologies that are so problematic that are plaguing us, to use that kind of language, are ideologies that have become distorted because they are cementing themselves in a certain point in time. And that creates a very fractured collective reality. How does this apply to us today? This applies to us today because this is actually one of the reasons I respect Jeffrey so much, is because he has a very astute perspective on how to, again, simplify what seem to be really complicated things. And one of the conversations we had a while ago was how he talked about how there can be no collective reality without a shared law. That was one of the earliest conversations we had that really stuck with me and led me through some of these reflections that I've been having, is that there seems to be no discernment among the ruling or the power class between law and morality. This is something, again, Jeffrey spoke to me about in 2018. And what he said, that the rule of law is steadily breaking down, like a unfortunately in this case a game of Tetris, block by block, row by row. except that this isn't a game and no one's winning, right? What happens is that when we don't have a collective reality, we don't have a collective rule of law, what happens is that you have a compass that points north in different directions at any hour in the day. And this inadvertently amplifies what is seen as a rupture, right? This amplifies the rupture, this amplifies the wound. Because when you are so adamant that things have to be just one specific way, or they have to reflect one specific time, and you've got different pockets of people and ideas all competing for different realities based on different points in time, you have the conditions to create a wound. And that's really just a really simple way to discuss, what is going on with our society right now, why it seems like human rights is a fantasy. It seems like a fantasy because twofold reasons. It seems like a fantasy, one, because we have stripped away this, the spirit of what it means to be a human. We've stripped away the spirit of what it means to be, to belong in a collective, the right to belong into a group, the right to participate, the right to be seen as equal, and specifically the right to be seen, right? When we otherize people, when we create a structure where people are othered, it makes it really, really hard to see them. And when you dehumanize someone, it makes it really hard to bring them back into the fold. And when you can't bring them back into the fold, you've created an enemy. And when you've created an enemy, you have found yourself to be not only a moving target, but you found other moving targets to latch onto. And this dynamic is a broken dynamic. It needs to die off. That is essentially, if we want to talk about disease, that is the disease of the world that we're living in right now, in terms of the power dynamics, in terms of the wars, in terms of the political conflict, the political theater. It is an issue of not seeing each other as people, not seeing each other as being within the fold. And again, to sum it up, that comes from in my studies and in my belief systems that I have. Well, they're not really belief systems. It's research based, right? Of reflections, observations. What it comes down to is not seeing something with wonder, even the wound, especially the wound. You've got to see it with wonder. You've got to be curious about why this thing is festering, why it seems to be that, something erupts a certain way, or it moves a certain way, or it seems to deviate or, degenerate. We've got to treat it with a sense of wonder. And with wonder, there is a degree of reverence. And it's not to say that we should exalt what seems to be broken, but we need to at least treat it like anything that we would when we're in a serious scientific inquiry. We treat it as an equal, right? We treat it with a sense of equality, with a sense of integrity. We bring it closer to us. We don't just push it away and say, okay, that is over there, that is a problem. We want to study it. And studying it doesn't mean staring at it. Studying it doesn't mean taking an aim at it. Studying it doesn't mean, engaging in the same patterns that created the problem in the first place, with humanization and language and rhetoric that seems to just look to score points rather than really resolve the wound. And I think we can do better. And that is the invitation I offer to all of us, is, can we see the wound with wonder? Can we bring it back into the fold? Can we look at the thing that is most challenging in our society, or however it may affect you in your personal life, and can we bring intimacy to it, right? Not just othering it, not just tolerating it, but can we bring intimacy to it by really looking at it closely and saying, let me hold this close and let me understand this for as long as it takes. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it, doesn't mean you have to condone it, doesn't mean you have to support it, but it does mean bringing it closer and looking at it with a human eye, rather than a very mechanical, sanitized lens where unless something completely falls into line, it cannot possibly belong. I think that era of the human perspective of how we see the other, I think that time has expired, and I think it's time to bring things back into the fold. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, I can be reached on my website, shireenqudosi.com, SHIREENQUDOSI. Thank you so much. And again, thank you, Jeffrey.